Welcome to Second Saturday. I'm your host, Professor Alfonso Severos. People often refer to Africa as if it is a country rather than a continent. It is a continent and home to 54 independent, unique countries, with South Sudan being the latest addition. Each country has its own currency, flag, anthem, history, cuisine, music, identity, and blend of cultures. In fact, more than 2,000 languages are spoken in Africa, and its 1.3 billion inhabitants are made up of over 3,000 distinct ethnic groups. Africa is also bigger than what most people think. If you combine the USA, China, India, Europe, and Japan, they all can fit into Africa. The USA fits into the African continent 3 times. Africa is the second largest continent, second only to Asia. With wars, revolution, children soldiers making the news, it's no wonder that the myths about Africa being a dangerous place is a common one. And of course, bad news is news. You don't get to hear enough about the good things that are happening on the continent. How often do you hear about Botswana, Senegal, or Ghana in the news? How often is the middle class or its university systems talked about? The fact that the GDP of Nigeria is ranked 19th in the world. More about the cell phone technology revolution occurring in Kenya. Today's show is about misconceptions and challenges in Africa. Joining me is Kevin Marunge, Director of Human Rights, Foreign Policy for Global Kids, Inc. Kevin, welcome to the show. I also have to say, Kevin has a master's degree in international affairs from American University. Welcome to Second Saturday. It's an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Kevin, before we begin this discussion and before you join in this discussion, let's watch a short video on some of the misconceptions about Africa.
Maybe there's so many myths. I have to think hard about a myth about Africa. Are there myths that we need to dispel about Africa? I think one of them is the myth of brain drain, the argument that when African scientists leave Africa, that the continent gets poorer and therefore underperforms. I think this is a myth because what we are starting to see is a large number of African scientists, in fact, working with their own countries and contributing back to the continent. And one can argue that if those scientists didn't live in the first place, they wouldn't have the technical knowledge that they have acquired by being overseas. And so the real myth here is not so much that people leave, but because they don't get utilized by their own countries.
I think Africans are capable now to make use of the resources which are available, to also make use of the foreign aid that they receive. And now Africa is asking for more trade than aid, because there are now potentialities in Africa for resource development, especially at this day. People now talking about the food crisis. Africa has a potential to produce food for itself and beyond itself if the resources are made available for her and the help.
If a farmer loses 20 to 25% of his output, that's a lot. And why? Partly because there is no way of preserving the food. Secondly, there is no transport system that will make the farmer take the food straight to the market. The marketing arrangement is very difficult. These are peasant farmers, by definition. They don't have the skill to organize large marketing and so on. So if we can look at some of these and tidy up the loose ends, it will have immediate impact on food accessibility. That, I must say, it does not mean we don't need more food, we don't need to grow more food, but we also need to optimize the harvest that we make every year.
People believe that Africa is just one country. Africa is a very big continent, and it's like Asia and has many, many countries. And various countries are at different stages of development and also have different types of problems. So we are usually lumped in one category as a useless continent, where most of the times what you read in the paper is very negative. They show us mostly of what people starving, wars, HIV, AIDS, and all that stuff. And I think that needs to stop.
Africa has 54 countries. I'm talking about, both sub-Saharan African, not African countries. And there are some of them that actually, have very fast-growing economies, and corruption is minimal. The democratic institutions are quite strong, and governance is very good. There may not be so many of them, but there are quite, a few of them that have done very well by every objective indicator.
Nowadays, all of the African countries are extremely committed to spending more money as well as resources for education, and that's extremely important because we believe that's the only way to really sustain development in Africa.
So if Africans are now talking about their own development, that's the starting point of the ownership. And this is what was not there from the outset.
It is not always that African countries go hungry because they choose to. Take, for example, between Japan and Kenya. Kenyan people spend 41 billion Kenya shillings every year to purchase Japanese products. On the other hand, the Japanese people only spend 1.3 billion shillings every year to buy Kenyan products. So who is helping who?
You may need to know that people with disabilities in Africa are also dying of HIV and AIDS because they don't have information, they don't have the knowledge. So the kind of policies that we want to see are the policies that will ensure that people with disabilities have access to all basic services.
Réellement, de sortir un peu de cette image qu'on donne de l'Afrique, d'abord une image négative d'un continent en conflit. C'est faux, l'Afrique n'est plus en conflit. Il n'y a pas que les conflits en Afrique. Il y a une Afrique qui gagne, il y a l'Afrique des sportifs, il y a l'Afrique des chanteurs, il y a l'Afrique du théâtre, l'Afrique du cinéma, l'Afrique du savoir. Donc il y a une Afrique qui gagne, qui est là, mais il y a une Afrique également qui a besoin qu'elle soit accompagnée pour qu'elle ne soit plus le marché ou le continent des matières premières.
You can't feed the poor people theories. If development comes within a country, it needs to be felt. And I think Africa as a whole is trying to achieve that more than they've ever tried to achieve that. And with the collaboration of places, the international community and places like Japan as we're here, the future is very promising and we will achieve that.
One of the topics addressed in the video was the issue of aid versus trade. I take the position, if you ask most Westerners, and by Westerners I mean Americans, they would take the position that Africa is more inclined to ask for aid as opposed to trade. How true is this?
I think it's increasingly untrue, and there was a lot to digest in that video that we just saw. I feel like the issue of aid versus trade is not as clear-cut as some might want to believe it is. There's a place for both. There's definitely a need for stimulating Africa's trade with not only the West, but increasingly with nations in the East, in the Far East, for example, China, I know, which we'll be talking about. But there's still a place for development aid, and very, very much needed development aid, but done in a way that makes sense. The old way of doing things, the way that has existed since independence, funneling aid directly to governments, sometimes corrupt governments, sometimes in countries with poor governance, doesn't work.
So you're saying there should be a balance, a partnership between this aid and trade?
Absolutely.
Let me ask you this: one of the things that I think about when we look at aid and aid to Africa. Many times when you look at NGOs and foundations, they do not include Africans in the decision of what the aid will be used for.
Right.
In other words, non-Africans, are deciding where the money should go.
Right.
It seems to me to be more productive if Africans were part of that decision-making process.
And that's a large part of the entire problem with dealing with Africa. It's often prescriptive, and it doesn't take into account the needs of the people. Who knows best what the needs of the people are? It's the people. So the World Bank, the IMF should not prescribe what development assistance should be used for. It should be the people on the ground. It should be used to support grassroots industry in a lot of developing nations in Africa. It should be used to support entrepreneurial spirit, and we're seeing a lot of entrepreneurial spirit among young people in Africa. What is often referred to as the cheetah generation, as opposed to the rhino generation, which is the old, slow-moving politicians who've been in power for decades upon decades. We're seeing this is a young continent, massive population under 35.
Absolutely.
Those are the cheetah generation, and they have an entrepreneurial spirit, and they're starting businesses that are, causing these economies to prosper right now. Those are the industries that the aid should be funneled to, not through the pockets of corrupt politicians.
I agree with you. Some people take the position that Africa does not produce enough food to feed its own, and therefore more aid is required. Does or can Africa produce enough food to feed its people?
Unequivocally, yes. And the issue is some of these unfortunate issues that may have been discussed in the video. It's reality that there's conflict in some of these countries. And unfortunately, conflict in some of these very resource-rich countries. Democratic Republic of Congo, for example. A very fertile land, resource-rich land that has been mired in conflict for the last 20 plus years. That country can afford to feed itself and then some, and can afford to, if resources were harnessed well, if there was training, if there was, a return to a situation where there's no conflict, having people actually return to agriculture, to their farms. That country can feed itself and export food to the rest of the world. As it stands now, and we were talking about this before,
absolutely.
Right now, the fish in the country die because nobody fishes them. They die of old age.
It's amazing.
It is, but it's about, offering the conditions, the training, the capacity for people to return to these kind of productive activities, and Africa can feed itself and probably the rest of the world as well.
Wow. People don't realize that when you look at the 54 independent African nations, that independence is barely over 50 years for many of these nations. So it's new, it's emerging, and it's still working through many issues. I recently read a quote by a Dr. Yosi Iwela. I'm probably mispronouncing the name.
That's pretty good, though.
And I apologize. She was the finance minister of Nigeria and also one of the ministers of the World Bank. And she talked about this issue of aid versus trade and how Africans should not feel bad about receiving aid. And I loved her justification. And believe it, I never made these connections until I heard her say this, that the reason why Africa should not feel bad about receiving aid is because the United States, United Kingdom, and Europe economies were built on African aid. And that African aid was in the form of human resources, slavery. And she's absolutely right. Historically, over 12 million individuals taken from the continent, providing free labor for 2 centuries. That's some pretty good aid. We looked at the video, talked a little bit about the 54 unique, diverse, independent countries in Africa. And I'm really talking about sub-Sahara. In doing my research for this show, a few things really struck me. And one was the mobile cell phone revolution occurring in sub-Sahara Africa. It's the largest cell phone market in the world. And I'm sitting there reading this, I'm learning this. I said, why didn't I know this? You know, we don't associate technology with Africa. But the technology is exploding all across the continent, and in some very unique and creative ways.
Absolutely.
And Kenya, your homeland, about 45 million is the population, and 80% of the households have at least one cell phone. Tell me a little bit about how Kenya is using cell phone technology.
Absolutely. I'll get to the mobile issue in a second, the technology issue. Just going back to the doctor's quote,
Right.
It's largely what we've seen in the past in the way the global north deals with the global south. And she raises, I think, the larger point of this imperialistic mentality that needs to be done away with.
It's old imperialism and the old colonial model.
That can't be the way you look at a trading partner in order for that partner to be successful, or both partners to be successful. Africa can't continue to be a source of raw materials and a market for finished goods without any skills being transferred along the way.
It's an interesting notion. I know we're going to come back to that when we talk about China.
Yes, we will.
Because that's one of the concerns some people have.
Yes, we will. In terms of the mobile tech, there was a TED Talk I watched once about how this mobile technology exploded in Africa. And the point that was made is that necessity is the mother of invention.
Right.
And it really is. Everybody in the West is used to the phone at home working well. Landlines were not reliable in many a country in Africa. So this mobile technology was something that made sense for everybody to kind of gravitate towards. And then once they gravitated towards it, they began to find ways to make it as useful as possible. Right. And you talk about some of the advances in Kenya, and it's truly amazing. Whenever I go home, people are using their cell phones. And I'm not talking about smartphones. I'm not talking about your iPhone 6, a flip phone to pay your child's school fees. You live in Nairobi, you're paying your child's school field in a rural area 4 hours away with the click of a button on your flip phone. They have this innovation called M-Pesa that made all of that possible. Mobile banking.
It's a banking system, yes.
And it's truly amazing. And a lot more countries are coming on to adopting this kind of mobile technology, with Kenya being the birthplace of it.
Sure.
And out of necessity.
Right.
And it's interesting because the conception, like you said, is a lot of these African nations don't have that kind of technology.
And here's the thing. The apps for all these various applications are being written by Africans.
Yes.
This is not apps being created by Google and Apple. These are Africans developing the apps and technology to address their day-to-day situations.
Yes.
And I was amazed. I was reading about the taxi buses, and they have this system where you buy a card, and the card is for so many rides. And the conductor scans the card with the cell phone. Now, that's not too, sophisticated, but here's this sophistication. Every time the conductor scans a card, that information automatically goes into a database, and it's financially analyzed. So the ownership has minute-by-minute updates on the financial state of the business. That's sophisticated.
It is. And there's innovations like that cropping up all the time. There's a kind of centralized hub of innovation and invention and young entrepreneurial Africans in Kenya creating these apps. It's called iHub. And Ushahidi also came out of this kind of innovation. Ushahidi, which created the disaster mapping software that was used to aid people during the earthquake in Haiti, and they decided to make that open source so it can be used. It was used to map where the need for the most aid was during the Japanese tsunami. That came out of Ushahidi, which came out of a group of young entrepreneurs in Kenya. If you go to iHub now, they'll show you an app where a farmer can type in information punch in information about your cows, and the app will tell you when your cows are ready to be inseminated.
Amazing.
It's being used for practical, everyday uses that are benefiting the economy.
Sure, exactly. Where it's not necessarily just gaming and entertainment. One area that we cannot talk about misconceptions and development without talking about health development. Now, just like I was shocked with the cell phone technology, Rwanda. And I have to read this data because most people I know, you mention the word Rwanda and they only think genocide. Yeah. I mean, hey, no one mentions America and they think genocide of Native Americans. That's another thing. But let me read this quote. And this is an amazing quote. Over the last decade in Rwanda, deaths from HIV, TB, tuberculosis, and malaria, and this is over a decade, 10-year period, dropped 80%. Maternal mortality dropped by 60%. And if you think that's amazing, listen to this. Life expectancy doubled in a 10-year period. That's totally unheard of. All on an average health care cost of $555 per year. Over the last 10 years, Rwanda health development has led the most dramatic improvement of health in history. Rwanda is the only country in sub-Saharan Africa on track to meet most of the Millennium Developmental Goals. I don't know how true that is, but maybe we'll get a chance to address that. But deaths from HIV, TB, malaria, they significant reduction. Even as the population increased by 35%. These are amazing numbers. And Rwanda is one of the 9 countries in the so-called underdeveloped world that's instituting universal health care. And when doing this research, I'm telling you, I was floored because I never heard it. And it's not something most people that I know associate with Rwanda. And they're also using cell phone technology. The Minister of Health, they trained 45,000 healthcare workers that just blanket the country. And they use cell phone technology and apps to build a medical record system that's centralized. That's better than we got here.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have... If I go to one hospital, I got records of me at that hospital, then my doctor over here had records of me from that doctor. But there's really no centralized medical record system. But this is amazing stuff. This is universal health care. Here's my question to you, Kevin. Is universal health care the way in which African countries must go? And if they do go in that direction, what are the implications? What is the concern about being labeled socialist or socialism?
For a lot of those human development indicators that you just mentioned, a lot of those can be achieved by universal health care. And I don't think universal health care is as controversial an issue in many an African country as it is here. It's a common sense approach to achieving human development.
Tell that to U.S. Congress.
So if you want higher life expectancy, if you want reduced infant mortality, these are things that you have to do. Healthcare has to be accessible to as large a portion of the population as possible, and it's done usually through good governance. Now, Rwanda, for me, is an interesting case. It's strong governance, I would say.
And I know you're going to bring up the issue of human rights, and I agree with you 100%.
Yes.
Am I right?
Yes, that is the issue I was going to bring up. But, you know, they're achieving a lot. They have required quota of women representation in government. They have one of the largest solar farms that was recently opened. A lot of innovative, common sense approaches to development in Rwanda.
Kevin, I don't want to cut you off, but time is running out.
Absolutely.
And I'm so happy the fact that you're on the next show. This is in 2 parts. I want to thank you for being on today's show. A significant percentage of the world's population live in the continent of Africa. And Africa is rich in natural resources. African population is a youthful population. And as time goes by, Africa will become even more a major player on the global scene. We currently are witnessing the growth in GDP across the continent, decrease in inflation and national debts. It is time that we move to the next chapter and change our perceptions of Africa. And it's 54 different unique nations. Most of these nations are in the process of building strong social and economic policies. Today, foreign investment in Africa is well over $200 billion a year, and the rate of the GDP growth in many nations is over 6% and growing. Well, this is our show for today. I hope you enjoy it. I would like to thank my guests, Kevin Marunge, the wonderful crew, team, we did that. And remember to join us on our second episode on Africa next month on the second Saturday.